the differences between the GMAT and the GRE, and these are exams that I think all of you sitting here tonight are going to be possibly taking in the near future. I know some of you are thinking about graduate school, some are thinking about business school, some are thinking about the short-term programs, and some are thinking possibly of taking these exams and saving them. But, you know, regardless of which exam you know, you prep for and study for, you're going to find that there's a lot of similarities between them in regards to how you need to kind of attack and be ready for them, how you need to prep. And you'll notice that they're even a lot different than the things you're currently doing right now in college. So as we're talking tonight, if there's questions, Derek, you can stick them in the chat box. That way I can get to them, you know, either at the end or during the presentation. But I think if questions pop into people's minds, I can get them answered, you know, usually right away. So the first thing we want to talk about is what's the GMAT, what's the GRE? All of you know is that they're standardized exams. Both of them are computer adaptive, meaning they're done on a computer, and they kind of adjust to the level that you're at when you're taking them in real time. So that's a pretty sharp contrast to what all of you did but prior to going to college, which is you took the ACT, you took the SAT. Remember, those were paper-based exams. The good news, though, is that I'm sure most of you aren't more than 3 years removed from taking those tests. So the reality is that you probably have a decent idea of the content that's covered on these exams from a math perspective, and in some cases from a verbal perspective as well. And that way it's easier than you taking this test than, say, a 29-year-old who hasn't seen this stuff in about 10 years. Now, the interesting thing about these two tests is that for the longest time, the GMAT was the only test you could take for business school. Now, that started to change in recent years. The GRE is also an exam that you can take for business school. And if I'm correct, I think about 14% of the people going into business schools are actually using their GRE scores as well. Now, what the GMAT is not used for is for most, or for many, not most, graduate programs. So if you want to, you know, go get a PhD in math or a, you know, master's in math, you would actually take the GRE. But on the flip side, I tutor a lot of students who have, who are going for a master's in accounting. They have to take the GMAT. But again, to be clear, it's not as if there are huge, huge differences between these exams. In fact, some people that I tutor going to business school end up taking both exams. So starting with the GMAT, as I said, it's computer adaptive, 3 hours and 30 minutes, give or take. You have a couple breaks in there. Consists of writing, integrated reasoning, a quantitative section, and a verbal section. So when you're talking to someone about their GMAT and they say, I got a 700 or a 650, what they're referring to is the quantitative and verbal score as a combined score. The writing assessment is a separate score. The integrated reasoning is a separate score. Now, the GRE, that is, you know, similar as far as different scores. You know, the main differences of the GRE is as far as how the test is set up is that you do have a verbal and a quant section and a writing section, but they're broken into multiple sections. And what's interesting about the GRE is if you do really well on, say, your first math section, given that it's computer adaptive, what happens is you'll see a harder math section in the following one. What's also interesting is that the GRE has what's called data interpretation questions. Now, those are actually very similar to the integrated reasoning questions that you see on the GMAT, except they're filtered throughout the math section in the GRE, and it's not its own actual section. You can see the test time is the same. So, you know, the idea of sitting down and taking these tests, and I know Derek is going to provide some homework for all of you at some point, and it's going to be sitting down and taking a diagnostic. You're going to see that it really is a mental marathon to get through these tests, and you know, you really have to be prepared. Even your worst final that you've ever taken in college, I'm pretty certain this is going to trump that when you sit down and take it. So to get a little bit more specific, as mentioned, the verbal sections, and you can see kind of how these compare. Now, the GMAT Verbal is 41 questions at 75 minutes. The GMAT Verbal is somewhat similar to the SAT, a little bit more than the GRE is. And, you know, the sentence correction, the critical reasoning, the reading comprehension are pretty standard sections. You know, sentence correction is what you would imagine. You're given a sentence, and the whole thing or part of it is underlined, and you have to determine whether or not that underlined portion is correct as written, or if there's mistakes, and thus, you know, new things need to be, or there needs to be a better version of that sentence, which you would see effectively in answer choices A through E. Critical reasoning question, this is something that's heavily tested on the LSAT actually as well, in actually a more difficult way. That is a short paragraph, 2 to 3 sentences, asking you things like, you know, how can you strengthen the conclusion, how can you weaken the conclusion, things like that. Then finally, reading comprehension, very similar to SAT, and even different from the reading comprehension that is on the GRE. It's just a passage, and you're simply asked questions on this very, very particular or specific passage. The GRE Verbal is a little different. You know, with the text completion, that is actually a short passage, you know, 1 to 5 sentences, and there are a few blanks within that passage, and you need to basically fill in the blank. There's 3 answer choices per some of the blanks, or 5 answer choices, but that is obviously something that's different from what's on the GMAT. And the sentence equivalence questions on the GRE is a single sentence with, again, 1 blank, and you have to select 2 of the answer choices. And so you can see the GRE Verbal does differ sharply from the GMAT Verbal. You know, what's interesting is that some of the programs that students apply to through the GRE are almost more verbal-based programs, like, you know, if you're talking a PhD in history or PhD in English or something like that, sometimes they'll look at the GRE Verbal quite heavily in determining you as a candidate. So with that said, I want to talk a little bit more about the sections that I know most students struggle with. Well, I guess we can talk about the GMAT integrated reasoning first, but then I want to get into the math. The GMAT integrated reasoning, for any of you who are going to start kind of your GMAT journey this year or save your score, what's interesting about this section is it's a few years old, and it was brought about, I think, because people who were, you know, using this test to determine which applicants they were going to accept into their schools really wanted to have a section that dealt with more graphical analysis, and there really was nothing on the GMAT prior to this. It was more your basic math, which I'll get to shortly. And so right now, the schools still don't really know what to do with this section, but let's say you're taking this test in, you know, 2 months, and you're deciding to save it. You know, who knows what they're going to be doing in 3 or 4 years down the line, so this is something you'll want to get good at. The good news, though, is that it takes the same math you learn in any quant section, and it's applied to graphical entry and things like that, text, tables, etc. And this is actually the one section on the GMAT where you can use a calculator. And what's interesting is you can use a calculator in the GRE, and you can't on all sections except for integrated reasoning on the GMAT. Now, the GMAT quantitative section, there's 37 questions. There are problem solving and also what's called data sufficiency. We'll get into those in a little bit. But data sufficiency questions are interesting. They'll be new to you, but they're not that bad once you kind of get used to them. And the total time is of course 75 minutes. That gives you about an average of 2 minutes per question. So what that means specifically is that you really don't have a lot of time for each question. You really don't have a lot of time to think. You really need to be so on point that as you see questions, you're immediately attacking them and you're using every bit of time that you have. You know, one of the main issues I hear about students is that they understand the content, but they struggle with getting the stuff done in a reasonable amount of time. So this is something I'm sure will be practicing further as you kind of dive into your studies. Now, on the flip side, the GRE quantitative section is a little different. There's a total of 40 questions, but remember, as I said earlier, that's 2 sections. When they changed the GRE a few years ago, they added in some different types of questions. They've always had multiple choice and quantitative comparison, and quantitative comparison we'll get into shortly. That's kind of like the GRE's version of data sufficiency. But something that they do now is they have multiple choice questions where you can put in multiple answers. So instead of just A through E, they could have answer choices, let's say A through G, and you could select 2 correct answers, 3 correct answers, or more. And they also added in the numeric entry question, where instead of picking an answer from A through E, you just have to put in the actual numerical value that is the answer to the question. In total, you have 70 minutes, which means 35 minutes per section. Now, the good news about these exams, even if you're someone who's straddling the fence on which exam to take, you literally can study for the GMAT and then turn around and take the GRE right after. And again, I've seen it. And the reason people do it is because sometimes the GMAT doesn't quite click for everyone, especially on the quant side. Although the same topics are tested, if you were to take a GMAT practice test tomorrow and a GRE one the next day, you really would notice that the quant that's tested and the way it's tested is just a lot easier. And people are always shocked by how much easier it is, but you know, I've seen it with my own 2 eyes as well. I feel like it's definitely easier math the way it's you know, produced and the way it's asked. Now the good news again is that these 22 quant topics carry through both exams. So it ranges. I mean, basic arithmetic on an easy end, algebra on the easy end, through number properties, which is a really hard topic on the GMAT, exponents, inequalities, rates and work, which is something maybe you did a little bit in high school, but not a ton, overlapping sets, statistics, combinations, probability, through geometry, functions, sequences, etc. So that's a lot of stuff. And you know, you guys are going to be gearing up for this possibly this summer, possibly before. What I can tell you is it's just a whole lot of information. And when you talk about either of these exams, you know, you have the GMAT that has 37 questions, and you have the GRE, which has slightly more questions, but there's thousands of variations in the way that things can be asked. So this isn't a test where you can say, well, I'm just going to cram for a week and do well. Granted, there are people who are capable of that, but by and large, most people have to sit down, they have to map this out, they have to study for a number of months, and you really have to dedicate yourself. So given that you're in college and there's other stuff going on, you know, you have classes and you have your social life, you know, the one thing I can tell you is this is probably the best time you'll have to be able to take this, because if you're working full time, you know, you have a lot more to deal with than just studying and things like that. So on that note, we talk about what are some successful study habits. So, you know, I've been working with students for the past 8 years, and I am always telling them the same things. And, you know, we also created our own curriculum that our students follow, and it's very detailed. And it's very detailed because, as I said, these exams are detailed. So as you learn, you want to make sure you're not just buying a book and jumping around. You really want to learn each topic in its own right, move to the next, move to the next, move to the next. Now, of course, you're going to forget information. So as you're reading stuff, as you're doing practice, take notes. Make sure that you can go back in 2 weeks and say, okay, I understand exactly where I struggled in a given topic, and I'm going to make sure I don't forget quadratics, for instance, or probability. Because the reality is all this information will get lost. If you're in school and you're taking other classes, you have to leave room in your brain to be able to understand the stuff you're doing in accounting or in history or in English. It doesn't matter, but this is a lot of stuff. And then when you have all these notes compiled in flashcards, you review. So every so often you say, you know what, I'm going to go back, I'm going to review the stuff I did a few weeks ago, or I'm going to review a certain chapter. And that's going to put you in a really, really good place to succeed. The last part is practice. Now, again, something we did in our curriculum is we put about 2,000 practice questions plus along with the materials. The purpose is so that you can practice what you learn. I love to use a golf analogy when talking about GMAT and GRE prep. It's, you know, if you were to go get a golf lesson and you were to be hitting the ball really, really well, standing next to your pro, and then he leaves, if you don't pick up a club for another 3 weeks, there's no way you're never going to develop that swing and keep it the way you want it to. Well, that's the same thing on the GMAT. If you read a chapter on rates and then you don't practice for 3 weeks, you can never expect yourself to be able to learn it and understand it the way that you're expected to when you have to take an actual GMAT exam. So, you know, none of this is new to any of you. If any of you play sports in college or any of you have learned to play an instrument, I mean, practice makes perfect. It's you know, one of those silly things that you always hear, but it's incredibly true when it comes to GMAT. So what we get to do now is some fun questions here, and we don't have to do a ton of these, but we can do enough where you guys can start to understand a good idea of what's going on with the GMAT and how it works, and the GRE. So what's interesting is this is a units digit problem or units digit example, and the way units digits work is that a units digit is like the ones place of a number. So if I have the number 123, 3 would be the units digit. Now, the cool thing about units digits, and keep in mind on the GMAT, there's no calculator. So they're saying 6 to the 6 is equal to which of the following. Now, the trap in this question, which you'll see on this screen here, is to do this, then this, then this, then this, then this. Now, obviously, I just gave away the answer. The answer is C, but no one on the GMAT is ever expecting you to do hard math calculations. Now, the flip side of this is that this question probably wouldn't be on the GRE because you can just plug that into a calculator. But what's cool is what this is actually testing is, do you understand how unit digit patterns work? So as you look at this solution here, oh, I didn't have the solution there. That's just the trap. So I'll go through this myself. The process is that 6 raised to any power will always end or have a units digit of 6. Now, we could keep on going forever and ever, and I could give you what 6 to the 3rd is, which we see as 216, or we could just understand that a base of 6 raised to any integer exponent is always going to have a units digit of 6. So what do you do here? Well, you say, okay, now that I know that pattern, I'm going to go to my answer choices and recognize that each one has a different units digit. That's a telltale sign, besides the way the question is being asked, that they're testing units digits here. So what's really cool is you don't have to do the math out. You find the answer choice that has the units digit of 6, and there's your answer. Now, what's great about all this is that you're in a position where you could do this question in about 15 seconds if you know this rule. So this is kind of a very small portion of the types of things you have to know for the GMAT, but keep in mind, this is the way that they're testing you. They're not ever expecting you to do super hard math. So getting into, and we can skip over this example, I want to talk specifically about some very specific types of GMAT and GRE questions. And what we're going to do is we're going to take this idea of the unit digit pattern of 6, and we're going to apply them to these other types of questions. Now, earlier in the webinar, you probably heard me say something about data sufficiency questions. Now, these questions are going to be new to everyone here, unless you've started studying for your GMAT at this point. The point of a data sufficiency question, and they do make up about 1/3 of the quant section on the GMAT, is you're given 2 statements. First, you're asked a question, and sometimes there's given information along with that question. And then you're given 2 statements, and the idea is, can those statements answer the question for me? Meaning, are they sufficient to answer the question? And so the possible answer choices are that the first statement gives you the information you need only. The second statement gives you the information you need only. Either of them give you the information in D. And then there's an option of C or E where you need them both together for sufficiency, or E is the answers are not sufficient based off of using your information in your statements. Now, I realize this may sound confusing. You may be a little nervous about this, but these questions really are not that bad at all. You will definitely be able to get through them successfully. So to do an example here, you'll notice that we're back to our units digits. So this question says, if n and n are positive integers, what is the units digit of x to the n? Now, if I was standing in front of you and I asked, what did you just learn about the units digits of a base of 6 raised to a power? I'm hoping that everyone would be saying, yes, Jeff, they always end in a 6. Now, why is that important? Because what we've been given here is something that looks vague, x to the n. Well, we don't know x and we don't know n, but if you go to statement 1 and you say x is 6, this means we now have 6 to the n. And what did I just say about a base of 6 when raised to any integer power is that the units digit, which is what we're solving for, ends in a 6, which means statement 1 is sufficient to answer the question. We always have to check the second statement. That's telling us that we have n equals 4. Knowing that x is to the 4th power doesn't tell us what the units digit is, because x could in fact be any set of values, and x to the 4 thus would be any set of values. So this is actually answer choice A. Now again, this could be confusing for people. I don't want you to worry. This is like a medium level GMAT question. So, you know, if you are looking at the GMAT for the first time, yes, this may be a bit much, but I promise you in time you'll easily be able to deal with this. Now, for those interested in what's going on with the GRE, the kind of data sufficiency equivalent is called the quantitative comparison question. These I will say are a little bit easier. As you see, there's only 4 answer choices instead of 5. And the idea of a quantitative comparison question is to determine which column is greater, column A or column B. In this case, the answer choices say quantity A is greater, quantity B is greater, the two are equal, or you don't have enough information to determine the relationship. So in a way, it's kind of similar to data sufficiency, but you're being asked to do something a little bit different, and in my opinion, what they're asking of you here is not as difficult. So we look at the same question. Now, you'll notice we're given some given information. N is a positive integer. Now, column A says the units digit of 6 to the n. Now, what did I tell everyone about units digits of a base of 6 raised to a power? The units digit is 6. So what we know is that column A has a value of 6. You look over to column B and you say, oh, wow, column B also has a value of 6. So right away, you can say these are equal, and there you go. So again, these are two kind of interesting ways that you can definitely see these questions, but I want everyone to see kind of the differences between, you know, a data sufficiency question on the GMAT, quantitative comparison on the GRE. But all of this stuff is learnable, all of it. So I don't want anyone being nervous at this stage of the game. You know, you're seeing this stuff literally for the first time here. Now, a couple other things I want to talk about, then we can wrap up, and I'd be happy to answer any questions. You know, people always ask, what is a good score in the GMAT? And they ask the same thing on the GRE. And there isn't a right or wrong answer because, as everyone knows, it's all relative. But if you're looking to go to the best programs in the country or the world or what have you, yes, you're going to want to be breaking that 700 barrier. But if you're going to a program that's not as high up on that scale, you know, a score, you know, to start, a 540 is basically the median score in the GMAT right now. You know, some programs will ask you to get a 540. Some will ask you to get a, you know, 600. I mean, you know, in a day's time, I go from tutoring students who want to go to, HBS's full-time MBA program where you need to get a 720, or someone who wants to go to, say, as an example, Clemson's Master's in Accounting program where they need to get a 600. So every score has its own range. The other interesting thing about the GMAT, though, is that the verbal score carries more weight than the quant. So if you get a really, really high verbal score, that's going to help a lot bringing up your overall score. And the GRE, this is kind of a new scoring system that they instituted a few years ago. But you can see here, the means for the verbal and the quant are about a 150, 152. The interesting thing is it's easier to do well in the math on the GRE. So whereas getting like an 85th percentile quant on the GMAT is really hard, it's not close to unheard of on the GRE. And in fact, people get it quite a lot. I tutor a lot of students that get upwards of 160, 161, 162 in the GRE, and those same students would not replicate that on the GMAT quant. But again, it's all relative. So for all of you thinking of going to different programs, reach out to those programs, start doing your research, your due diligence, and figure out what the score is you need for them, because you don't need to get a high score just for the sake of getting a high score. So a couple of things that may be of note here for some of you, if you're thinking, I may take my GMAT, through this program, but potentially save it. Here's an idea of, if you're trying to go to some top programs, what they're asking for. You can see Harvard starts with an average of 727, which is very high. And keep in mind, the average GPAs are high as well, down to Emory, which is a 680. But even though a 680 seems a lot lower than a 720, they're both great scores, and it takes a lot to get those scores. And, in addition to that, as everyone should know, there's more to you as an applicant than, just the GMAT. So everyone, just to real quick, too, as I wrap up here, I'm with Target Test Prep. I'm probably going to be helping Derek and doing a lot for Trailblazers moving forward. We're going to have you guys do some homework at some point, taking a few diagnostics. So you'll probably be, doing at least a few trials with our curriculum. But it's a product and a curriculum that we spent a lot of time on and feel really proud of, and we're happy to be able to share that with you guys at Trailblazers. And certainly we look forward to having a lot of different conversations with everyone, and helping you on the GMAT as much as you can. And as far as if anyone wants to reach out to me, you can email me directly here. I'd be happy to kind of walk you through what's going on with your personal GMAT at the moment, and answer any further questions you have. And I'd like to kind of open up the floor now, Derek, if there's any questions from your group that people want answered.